I never thought I'd be the kind of person to hire a private investigator. But when it comes to family, you do things you never thought you would. I still remember the night that pushed me over the edge. I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at my phone while the coffee went cold. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, and my brother's wife, Claire, kept popping into my mind. Claire was beautiful, the kind of woman who never looked tired even when she said she was. She had this soft voice that made you want to believe every word she said. And for years, I did. I loved her like a sister, but something had changed. My brother, Ethan, had been distant lately. He'd stop by our parents' house alone more often. He'd make excuses for Claire, saying she was busy or sick or tired. I'd ask how their marriage was going, and he'd just smile that tired smile and say they were fine. But I could tell he wasn't fine. He looked like a man walking around with something heavy in his chest. That night, he came to me after dinner with eyes red and wet. He didn't say much, just that Claire had been coming home late from work and he didn't know what to think. I told him maybe she's just working late. But even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. So I did something stupid. Or maybe it wasn't stupid, maybe it was protective. I told him I'd take care of it. I told him not to worry about anything, that I'd find out what was really going on. And he looked at me like I'd just handed him hope. The next morning, I called a private investigator named Carl Winters. He had a voice like gravel and didn't waste words. I told him I wanted him to follow my brother's wife for a few days. Nothing extreme, just to see where she went after work. He asked if I was sure, and I said yes, before I could think twice. He said he'd start that afternoon, and I spent the rest of the day pretending I wasn't shaking inside. I tried to focus on work, on cleaning, on anything, but my stomach felt tight the whole time. When he called me 3 hours later, my heart nearly stopped. I picked up on the first ring, and all he said was, "You need to see this now." I didn't even ask what it was. I just grabbed my keys and drove. The rain had started falling when I pulled into the parking lot of a little diner off Route 17, the kind of place with flickering neon lights and more coffee cups than customers. Carl was sitting in a corner booth with a manila envelope on the table. His face didn't show much, but his eyes looked heavy, like he'd seen something he didn't want to. He slid the envelope toward me without a word, and I opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Claire sitting in a car outside some house, Claire walking up the driveway, Claire standing close to a man I didn't recognize. They weren't holding hands, but they didn't have to. I could feel the closeness in the way they looked at each other. My throat went dry. I asked who he was. Carl said he was still checking that out, but the house belonged to a man named Paul Henson, a contractor, married once, now divorced, 2 kids living out of state. He said Claire had been visiting that house every few days for the last week, always around the same time, always leaving an hour or two later. I sat there staring at the photos, and I felt something twist in me, not just anger, but heartbreak for Ethan, for what this would do to him. I asked Carl to keep going, to find out everything he could, but he looked at me and said, "Miss, I think you already know enough." But I didn't. I needed the truth, all of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her smiling at that man like she used to smile at Ethan, and I hated her for it. And I hated myself for ever doubting her before. The next morning, Ethan called, said Claire was working late again, and something inside me broke. I told him to come over, that I had something to show him. But when I saw him walk in with that tired hope in his eyes, I couldn't do it. I couldn't hand him those photos. Not yet. So I lied. I told him I was just checking in, told him maybe he should talk to her, maybe take her away for the weekend. He smiled a little, said he'd think about it. When he left, I sat there staring at the envelope on my kitchen table, and I realized what I'd done wasn't just spying. It was tearing something open that maybe wasn't mine to touch. That night, Carl called again, said he had more, and I met him, same place, same booth. This time his face looked different, more serious. He told me she hadn't gone to the house today. She'd gone to a hospital in the next town, and stayed there for almost 3 hours. I felt confused. She didn't have any family there, and as far as I knew, she wasn't sick. I asked him if he followed her in, and he said no, but she came out looking shaken. She sat in her car for a long time before driving home. Something didn't fit anymore. Maybe it wasn't what I thought. Maybe this man, Paul, wasn't what I assumed. Maybe there was more. But before I could untangle it, Ethan showed up at my house that night, out of breath, eyes wild, said Claire had fainted in the kitchen and the ambulance took her to County General. We drove there together in silence, the kind of silence that feels like 1,000 thoughts all shouting at once. When we got there, she was lying in the hospital bed, pale but awake. She looked at Ethan first, then at me, like she knew everything I'd done without me saying a word. Ethan asked what happened, and she said she'd been feeling dizzy for weeks, but didn't want to worry him, that she'd been going to the hospital for tests, but hadn't told him yet. My stomach dropped. She'd been going for tests, not to see someone else. I asked quietly what kind of tests, and she said they found something in her lungs, but she wasn't sure what it was yet. She looked at me when she said it, like she was asking for something. Forgiveness, maybe? Or understanding? I couldn't give her either. Not yet. Later, when Ethan stepped out to talk to the doctor, she looked at me again and said, "I know you've been following me. I saw him. I saw you too. You should have just asked me. I would have told you." I didn't say anything. I just stood there staring at the woman I'd thought I knew and felt every bit of guilt crawl up my throat. She said I didn't tell Ethan because I didn't want to scare him until I knew what it was. Please don't tell him yet, not until I have to. When Ethan came back, she smiled like everything was fine, and I realized how strong she was, stronger than me, stronger than I'd ever given her credit for. That night, I went home and tore up the photos, but the guilt didn't leave. It sat with me in the dark, whispering that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. And that's where it all began, the night I thought I'd protect my brother and instead uncovered something far more fragile than betrayal, the truth about what love does when fear gets in the way. I kept thinking about Claire in that hospital bed, the way she looked at me, like she knew every mistake I'd ever made, and I wanted to crawl under the floorboards and hide, but I couldn't. I had to sit there in the dark kitchen and sip cold coffee and think about what I'd done. The photos, the lies, the private investigator, the fear in Ethan's eyes when he asked me what was going on. I couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. I didn't know how. I kept replaying the last conversation in my head over and over. The words she'd said, the look on her face, that mixture of fear and strength, and somehow something soft and vulnerable that I hadn't expected. It made my chest tighten like someone had just pressed down on it, and I couldn't breathe properly. I spent the rest of the week doing nothing but waiting. Waiting for news from the doctor, waiting for Carl to call with anything else, waiting for Ethan to notice something was off, but he didn't. He just kept working late at the office, coming home exhausted, talking about nothing important. And I kept pretending everything was fine, and inside me, I was unraveling. Claire's tests were complicated, and the doctors didn't know much yet. They said they needed more scans, more biopsies, more time, and every time they mentioned time, I felt it like a weight pressing down on me. Like every second that passed was a second closer to a revelation I wasn't ready for. I tried to stay away from Carl because I knew if I saw him, he'd want answers, and I couldn't give him any. Not yet. But he called every few days, and I answered each time, my voice shaking, my hands shaking, my stomach in knots. And every time he said he had something, I felt that same rush of panic like the first day, and then disappointment when it turned out to be nothing more than her visiting the doctor again. But one morning, I woke up to a call that wasn't from Carl. It was Claire. She said she wanted to meet me alone. She sounded calm, but there was an edge to her voice that made my heart hammer. I didn't know if it was fear or anger or a mix of both. I agreed. We met at a little cafe 2 blocks from her house, the kind of place with peeling paint and cheap chairs and the smell of strong coffee and pastries that were probably a day old, but she didn't care. She ordered tea, and I ordered the same, and we sat in silence for a few minutes until she spoke. "I know you've been worried about me," she said, "and I know you hired someone to follow me." I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. My throat dry, my hands folded around the cup, and she smiled, just a little, like she understood something about me that I hadn't understood about myself. "I wanted to tell Ethan," she said, "but I couldn't. Not yet. I have something I need to handle first, something I need to fix, and I want you to be part of it if you're willing." I nodded again because I had no choice. I wanted to help, I wanted to make it right, but I didn't know how. Over the next few days, she let me in on small pieces of the story, nothing that made sense to anyone else, but it made sense to me. She had been trying to fix something from her past, a mistake she made long before she ever met Ethan, a debt she owed to someone who had helped her once, and she had been going to the hospital for tests because of the stress and the fear and sometimes the lack of sleep that came with keeping it all hidden. She didn't tell Ethan because she didn't want him to carry it with her. She wanted to spare him the worry, the guilt, the feeling that he had to do something when there was nothing he could do. It sounded strange when she said it out loud, but I could feel the truth in her voice. It was raw, it was real, and it made me want to cry, not because I was sad, but because I'd been wrong. I'd been so wrong about everything. I tried to apologize to her for following her, for doubting her, and she just shook her head and said, "Don't worry about it. It's done. It's over. Just promise me you won't tell Ethan, not yet, until I say it's time." And I nodded, and I meant it. I wanted to honor her trust, but inside me, I was still gnawing at the guilt like a hungry animal. I kept going to the hospital with her, sitting in the waiting rooms, reading magazines, pretending to be interested in recipes and home decor, while my mind raced with every possible scenario, every worst-case outcome, and every hope that maybe she'd be okay and maybe everything would be fine. One day, while we were sitting there, a nurse called her name and Claire went with her, and I sat in the chair staring at the floor and thinking about how much I had underestimated her, how much courage it took to keep the secret, to carry it on her own and still show up every day with a smile for Ethan and for everyone else. I knew then that my judgment had been clouded by fear, by my desire to protect my brother, and I had almost destroyed something precious in the process. Clara came back with a folder full of papers, and we went to a quiet corner of the hospital cafe. She opened it slowly and laid it in front of me. She said, "Read it all," she said. "Don't look at me, just read." And I did. And my eyes went wide because it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't photos of her with someone else. It wasn't evidence of betrayal. It was medical records, prescriptions, notes from specialists, and letters from a research program she had been part of months ago. It turned out Claire had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder, something that flared up unpredictably. She hadn't told Ethan because she didn't want him to worry, and because she wanted to handle the treatment herself before anyone else had to intervene. I sat there staring at the folder, my stomach twisting, my throat tight, and I felt tears run down my cheeks because I had assumed the worst. I had doubted her integrity and loyalty. I had let fear guide my actions instead of trust and love. She watched me quietly and said, "It's okay. I understand why you did what you did. I know it came from love. I just wish you'd ask me first." And I nodded because she was right. I should have asked. I should have trusted. That evening, I called Carl and told him to stop following Claire. I thanked him, but my voice broke halfway through because I realized how close I had come to ruining a marriage that wasn't mine to protect, how close I had come to betraying the woman who had trusted me the most. When I told Ethan the truth weeks later, it was one of the hardest moments of my life. I sat him down in the living room and explained everything, from the photos to the calls to the hospital visits. I braced myself for anger, for hurt, for disbelief, but he just listened, his eyes wide and wet, and when I finished, he hugged me and said, "Thank you for caring, but you didn't need to do that." I thought I'd be scolded or shouted at or maybe even hated, but he forgave me instantly, and it was a kind of relief I hadn't expected, a release from the guilt that had been pressing on me for weeks. Claire forgave me too. She smiled at me and said, "Sometimes love makes you do strange things." I nodded and laughed quietly because she was right. Love makes us all strange sometimes. It makes us doubt. It makes us spy. It makes us fear. It makes us hope. And sometimes it makes us see the truth in a way we never could before. After that, I realized forgiveness isn't just about telling someone it's okay. It's about seeing their intentions, about understanding the love behind their mistakes, about accepting that people we care about can surprise us in ways we never imagined. It wasn't easy letting go of the fear, letting go of the guilt, letting go of the constant worry. But I learned that day that love and trust are stronger than doubt and suspicion, and that sometimes the hardest thing you can do for someone is to step back and let them carry their own burdens until they are ready to share. And so life went on. Claire's health slowly stabilized, the hospital visits became less frequent, Ethan smiled more often, and I stopped feeling the need to control every detail, to know every step of her day. I realized my place was not to follow her, but to support her when she asked to be supported, and to love her and Ethan from the edges, quietly and faithfully. Sometimes late at night, I still think about those first photos that started everything. The fear in my chest, the panic in my hands, the feeling that I had to act before it was too late. I think about how easy it is to misjudge people when you only see a part of their lives, when you only see what you want to see. And I hope I never forget how close I came to losing sight of what really mattered. Because in the end, the real story wasn't about Claire or the photos or the PI. It was about trust. It was about love. It was about learning to forgive and to step back and let people show their true selves in their own time. And I hope anyone who hears this story understands that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is not to watch or follow or investigate, but to simply be there and listen and trust and forgive. I woke up that morning feeling the weight of everything pressing on my chest. The photos, the calls, the hospital, the fear that I had almost ruined everything. It made it hard to breathe, and I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floor, thinking about Claire and Ethan, and how fragile everything felt, like a glass ornament in a room full of children. And I didn't know how to make it stop. The sun was coming through the blinds in slanted lines, and I watched the dust float like tiny golden ghosts, and I realized I had been holding my breath for days, maybe weeks, since I first hired Carl. And I hadn't even noticed how tense my body had become. The tight muscles, the restless sleep, the gnawing at my stomach every time my phone rang or someone knocked on the door. It was like fear had moved into my bones and refused to leave. I got dressed slowly, avoiding the mirror because I didn't want to see the eyes that looked back at me. Those eyes that had betrayed trust, that had doubted love, that had judged without knowing, and I thought, maybe I was too late. Maybe no apology could fix the cracks I had made in someone else's life. I went to the hospital because Claire had asked me to sit with her. She said she needed someone she could talk to, someone who wouldn't make her feel guilty for being sick. And I thought about how strange it was that she trusted me so completely after everything. And I felt a lump in my throat because I didn't deserve that trust, but I wanted to honor it anyway. She was sitting in the small waiting room, curled in a chair with her arms around her knees, like she was holding herself together. I didn't say anything. I just sat across from her and let the silence stretch between us until she spoke. "I know you've been scared," she said softly, and I nodded because I had been scared, more than I ever wanted to admit. I thought about all the ways things could go wrong, all the ways I could ruin what little control she had left over her life, and my chest tightened again like a fist had closed around it. She smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes fear makes you do strange things." I laughed quietly because I knew exactly what she meant. I had hired Carl. I had watched her. I had assumed the worst. And I realized in that moment that love and fear were two sides of the same coin, and I had been flipping it too often, letting it dictate my every move. Over the next few hours, she told me about her illness, about the rare autoimmune disorder, about the treatments she had been hiding, about the nights she had spent alone, scared and exhausted because she didn't want Ethan to worry. She told me about the letters from specialists, the medications, the appointments she had been juggling quietly, like some kind of silent hero. And I listened, and I felt every ounce of guilt in me lighten a fraction, because now I understood the burden she had been carrying on her own. I asked her if she had wanted to tell Ethan, and she shook her head. She said no, not until she had more answers, not until she was sure she could protect him from the fear she had lived with. And I nodded because I knew I would have done the same if the roles were reversed, and I realized that my fear had been rooted not in doubt, but in my desire to shield my brother from pain that wasn't mine to fix. When I left the hospital that afternoon, the air felt different. Heavier, but not in a bad way. More like a weight I could now carry because I knew the truth. I drove home slowly, letting the city blur past the windshield, the lines of cars, the pedestrians, the traffic lights, all moving in their own rhythm, while I tried to find some rhythm from myself inside the chaos that had been my heart. I spent the next few days doing small things to help Claire without her asking. I picked up groceries, I cooked simple meals, I drove her to appointments, and I stayed quiet, mostly listening. I realized then that silence could be more powerful than words sometimes, and that support could be shown in the small, consistent acts that didn't demand recognition. Ethan still didn't know, and part of me wanted to tell him immediately, but another part of me understood that this wasn't my story to reveal. It was hers, and I had to respect her timing and her choice, even if it meant sitting with my own anxiety in the corners of my mind while she healed and figured out what to do next. One evening, I sat in the living room with my cup of tea and stared at the envelope of shredded photos I had kept from the first week I hired Carl. I remembered the panic, the anger, the despair, and I felt a shiver run down my spine because I knew how close I had come to breaking something beautiful. And I whispered to the empty room, "I will never do that again." And I meant it. Later that night, Claire called me. She sounded tired but calm, and she asked me if I could meet her for a walk in the park, just the two of us. And I said yes, and I drove slowly through the dark streets, feeling the chill of the night air against my skin, and thinking about the lessons I had learned, the value of patience, the power of trust, and the fragile beauty of forgiveness. We walked in silence at first, the leaves crunching under our feet, the distant hum of traffic, the faint smell of wet earth, and I felt a strange peace settle in my chest, like maybe the world wasn't so fragile after all. Maybe love could survive fear. Maybe trust could survive doubt. Maybe forgiveness could survive mistakes. She stopped at a bench overlooking the little pond, and we sat side by side, and she looked at me and said, "You've been carrying a lot." I nodded, because I had. I had been carrying guilt, worry, fear, and 1,000 imagined scenarios that never came true. I wanted to tell her everything I had learned, everything I had realized, everything I had feared, but I didn't. I just let the silence speak for me. She reached over and touched my hand lightly, just enough to anchor me, and said, "It's okay. You did what you thought was right." I smiled faintly because I knew she was right, and I felt tears come, but I didn't care. They were cleansing tears, not shameful ones. I realized then that love was messy and complicated and human, and it demanded courage even when it scared you. And I felt something in me shift, like the first real breath I had taken in days. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to a rhythm I could recognize. Claire's health improved slightly, the hospital visits became less frequent, and I stayed close, supporting quietly without interference. Ethan remained blissfully unaware of how close we had come to a crisis, and I realized that sometimes the hardest part of love is standing back and letting people face their own battles while offering steady, unwavering presence on the sidelines. I thought about the lessons this experience had taught me, the dangers of jumping to conclusions, the importance of listening, the strength required to forgive oneself for mistakes, and the power of being present without judgment. And I understood that my role in their lives was not to protect obsessively, but to love without intrusion and to trust that people can show their true selves when they are ready. At night, I would sit by my window looking out over the quiet streets and think about the day Claire had almost fainted, the calls from Carl, the shredded photos, the fear I had carried in my chest. And I realized that every heartbeat, every anxious thought, every sleepless night had led me to a deeper understanding of love, of trust, of family, and of myself. I had learned that mistakes do not define you. Fear does not control you, and forgiveness is the bridge that carries you from guilt to peace. And I whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for the lesson." And I meant it, because I had never felt more awake, more aware, more connected to the fragile human threads that bind us all together. And so I continued walking the path between fear and forgiveness, learning every day to step lightly, to listen more than I speak, to trust more than I doubt, and to carry love as quietly and steadfastly as the stars carry light through the night. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the sun barely creeping through the blinds, my hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, thinking about Claire and Ethan and the fragile rhythm of our lives, when the phone rang and I froze. It was Carl. I hadn't expected him to call, not today, not this week, and yet there he was, his voice low and hurried, saying, "We need to meet." I said yes before I even thought about what he might have found, and I grabbed my keys and left the house, leaving the kettle whistling on the stove. The streets were wet from an earlier rain, and the lights blurred in streaks as I drove, and every bump in the road made my stomach twist, because I knew whatever Carl had to tell me could change everything again. It could undo the fragile peace we had built over the last few weeks, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. I met him at the diner, the one with the flickering neon sign, the one that smelled of stale coffee and fried eggs, and I slid into the booth across from him, and he pushed a manila envelope toward me and said, "She's being followed again." I felt my chest tighten, my hands grip the edge of the table, because I didn't want to believe it. I had hoped the worst was behind us, and now it was creeping back in like a shadow I didn't see coming. I opened the envelope slowly, my eyes scanning the photos, and my stomach dropped. Claire leaving her house a few blocks from ours, walking into a car I didn't recognize, a man sitting in the passenger seat, smiling at her, and I could feel the panic rise in me because I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't know how to tell Ethan or if I even should. Carl said, "I don't know who he is or why he's following her, but he's been spotted twice this week, and I need to know if you want me to keep tracking." I nodded because I had no choice. I had to know the truth. I had to understand before anyone else got hurt, before Ethan's fragile trust was shattered, before Claire's secret world collided with our own. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought about every possibility, every worst-case scenario, every hidden motive. I replayed the past few weeks over and over, the hospital visits, the shredded photos, the quiet walks, the moments of trust, and I realized that fear was still guiding me, even though I had promised myself it wouldn't. I felt ashamed of my own mind, the way it leapt to conclusions, the way it spun stories that weren't real. Yet, I couldn't stop it. The next morning, Claire called. She sounded tired, but calm. She asked if I could meet her for a walk. She didn't say why, just that she needed fresh air. And I agreed, driving slowly, trying to steady my racing thoughts, the city passing by like a blur while my chest hammered with anticipation and worry. We walked along the river path, the water dark and calm, reflecting the gray sky and the bare trees. And she didn't speak at first, just let the silence stretch. And I realized that maybe she knew about the man following her. Maybe she didn't. Maybe this was just another test I wasn't prepared for. And I felt my hands fidgeting with my coat pockets, wishing for clarity. Finally, she said, "I know you're worried about me." I nodded because I was. I wanted to tell her about Carl, about the photos, about the stranger, but I stopped myself. I had learned already that some truths were hers to share and not mine to expose, and I had to trust her timing, even if my heart protested. She told me about her appointments, her treatments, the little tremors that came and went, the nights she spent awake and scared, and I felt the familiar guilt rise again for having doubted her, for having spied, for having let fear control me. I apologized quietly, in a whisper, to the wind, to her, to the universe. I didn't care. And she smiled faintly and said, "It's okay. We all do what we think is right, and that's enough sometimes." And I nodded, letting the words settle in my chest like warm water. That evening, I drove home slowly, the sky darkening into navy blue, and I thought about Ethan, still oblivious to the shadow trailing Claire, about the delicate balance of love, trust, and secrecy, about the lessons I was still learning about patience and forgiveness, and I realized that life would always test us in ways we weren't prepared for, and the measure of strength was how we carried ourselves through the storms. Over the next few days, Carl's calls became more frequent. He had updates, sightings, nothing concrete, but enough to keep my nerves taut, like wires stretched to breaking point. I spent my hours quietly observing Claire without interfering, noticing the way she laughed softly at a joke Ethan didn't hear, the way she winced at a cough or a tremor, and I realized again how strong she was, how much she carried on her own, how little she needed to be protected. If only I could step back and see without fearing. One afternoon, I caught her looking at me across the table at the cafe, her eyes steady and calm, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and shame. She knew I was watching. She didn't need me to follow her. She just needed me to be present in the quiet way I had learned to be. And I understood finally that protection didn't always come from action. Sometimes it came from witnessing, silently, with love and trust. The days blurred together, hospital visits, walks, quiet meals, conversations filled with pauses and unspoken words, and I began to feel a fragile peace weaving through the tension, the fear, the unknown. The man in the photos became a background hum, a reminder of vigilance, but not an anchor of panic. I could breathe again, knowing that Claire's strength was greater than my doubts and Ethan's love unwavering. Then one night, I received a text from an unknown number. Just a few words. "You need to see this," and a link to a short video. I felt my chest seize, my stomach twist, and I hesitated before opening it because I wasn't sure I was ready to face another revelation yet. I clicked, and my heart stopped. It was Claire, in her kitchen, talking to the man from the photos, her expression calm, her movements careful, and I realized then that the man wasn't a threat. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone helping her, someone part of her plan, someone she had trusted, and I had misjudged everything again. I felt tears run down my cheeks because I had almost let fear ruin my ability to trust, to see truth, to honor the strength of the woman who had carried so much on her own. I whispered into the dark of my kitchen, "I am sorry," and I meant it, because I had learned once more that love demanded patience, courage, trust, and the willingness to step back even when everything inside me screamed to act. That night, I called Carl and told him to stop following her permanently. I thanked him for his diligence, but I realized that no one could watch over her better than she could herself, and that my role was to be beside her, quietly, faithfully, and with complete faith in her strength. I sat by my window for hours after Ethan went to bed, thinking about all that had happened. The first call, the photos, the hospital, the walks, the calls, the unknown man. I thought about mistakes made in the name of love, about fear and trust, about the lessons we were still learning, and I felt a quiet determination settle in my chest that no matter what came next, I would carry myself with calm, patience, love, and unwavering belief in the resilience of those I cared for. Because I had seen the fragility of life, the depth of courage in Claire, the enduring love of Ethan, and I knew now that the real story wasn't about fear, about secrets, about mistakes. It was about learning to walk through life, trusting, believing, and forgiving. And I whispered to the night, "Thank you for teaching me," and I meant it. The morning came quiet and gray, the sky heavy with clouds, and I woke with a strange tightness in my chest, like a knot that refused to loosen. I thought about Claire, about Ethan, about the unknown man, about Carl, about every decision I had made in the last few weeks, and I felt both exhausted and strangely alert, like I was standing on the edge of something important without knowing what it would be. I dressed slowly, letting my hands linger on the fabric of my coat, feeling the roughness of the material against my skin, and I realized how tense I had been all week, holding myself in check, watching over Claire silently, keeping my fears to myself. And I wondered if anyone could feel the weight of worry as strongly as I did, without letting it show. I drove to the hospital, not because Claire had asked, but because I wanted to see her. I needed to know she was okay, even though I trusted her strength. Even though I had promised myself I wouldn't interfere, I wanted to be there to witness the day, to hold the quiet space beside her. And I realized how much of love is simply presence, without intrusion. She was sitting in the small waiting room, curled in a chair, holding a magazine but not reading it. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she adjusted her scarf, the slight tremor in her hands, and I felt a tang of guilt, because I had assumed the worst. I had doubted her integrity, and I had let my fear dictate my actions, instead of trusting her judgment, her choices, her strength. I sat beside her and didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch between us like a bridge we were building together. And she finally said, "I know it's been hard for you. I can see it in your eyes." And I nodded, because I had been carrying a heavy burden, and it had worn me down in ways I hadn't realized until she acknowledged it. She told me about the latest test results, the small victories, the frustrating setbacks, the ways her body seemed determined to fight against her, yet stubbornly fragile at the same time. And I listened quietly, feeling every ounce of admiration and love I had for her grow because she faced it all with courage and grace. I could only hope to match in my own way. Later that day, Carl called and said he had more information about the man from the photos, and I felt my stomach twist with a mixture of dread and curiosity. I told him to meet me at the diner, and I drove there slowly, the streets wet from another brief rain, the city quiet except for the occasional car, and the distant hum of traffic. And I felt the old tension return with a whisper, reminding me that life could change in an instant. When Carl arrived, he didn't sit down immediately. He slid the photos across the table and said, "I've checked his background. He's part of a research program helping patients with rare disorders like the one Claire has. He's been assigned to her case to monitor her treatment and progress." I felt my chest loosen as the words sank in, the panic evaporating slowly, like mist in the morning sun. I had misjudged him entirely, and I realized how easily fear could make you see shadows where there was only light. I left the diner with a strange mix of relief and shame, thinking about all the ways I had let my mind run wild, about Claire, about her choices, about the man helping her. And I resolved silently that I would keep trusting her decisions no matter what. I imagined I knew I had to step back and let her guide the way, while I simply offered my love, quietly, faithfully. That evening, I went to see Claire at home. We walked in her neighborhood, the streets lined with bare trees, the air crisp and fragrant with wet leaves. And she told me small stories about her childhood, about her favorite books, about the little things that made her laugh even in the midst of uncertainty. I listened and laughed with her, and felt a sense of calm settle over me, because I knew that even when fear crept in, we could carry on through patience, trust, and understanding. I kept thinking about Ethan and how little he knew about the quiet battles unfolding around him, and I realized again that my place was not to control the narrative, not to reveal the secrets, not to make decisions for others, but to witness, support, and love in the spaces between the chaos and the calm. I felt humbled by the responsibility and grateful for the lessons I had learned. Over the next week, Claire's health seemed to stabilize slightly. The tremors lessened, the hospital visits shorter, and she began to share a little more about the man helping her, the research program, the small victories she celebrated quietly in her journal. And I felt a deep respect for her courage and resilience, because she was facing a fight most people would crumble under, and she did it with dignity and strength. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Claire called me and said she wanted to meet at the park again. I agreed, and we walked under the faint glow of streetlights, past the river, the pond reflecting the moonlight and the crunch of leaves underfoot, and she told me about her plans for the next month, about how she wanted to approach Ethan about the diagnosis, about the treatments, and about letting him in slowly so he wouldn't feel helpless or frightened. I felt tears prick my eyes because I had underestimated her ability to handle the situation. I had assumed she needed saving, when in truth she was already navigating it with intelligence and heart. I realized then that my fear had almost ruined everything. The misplaced spying, the assumptions, the frantic calls to Carl, the anxiety that had gripped me so tightly, and I whispered quietly into the night, "I am sorry for everything," and I meant it, because the lesson was clear. Love requires trust, patience, and restraint. That night, I drove home slowly, the city quiet around me, my thoughts turning over and over the fragility of life, the strength of human spirit, the lessons of trust and forgiveness, the realization that fear can mislead and that patience can guide. I felt a strange peace settle over me, knowing that I could finally step back and allow Claire to lead the way, and I could love her and Ethan without interference. The days passed with subtle shifts, each small improvement in Claire's health, each careful choice in her treatment, reinforcing the quiet understanding that life was fragile yet resilient, and that mistakes made in the name of love could be forgiven and repaired if approached with honesty and humility. I watched her closely, without intruding, learning again and again that the most powerful acts of love were often silent and patient, the kind of presence that offered comfort without pressure, guidance without control, and support without judgment. And I felt a deep gratitude for the chance to witness it all, to learn from it, and to grow along with them. And so the quiet rhythm of our days continued, a delicate balance of love, trust, and forgiveness, a slow unfolding of truths and small victories, a journey that taught me over and over that patience, courage, and faith in those we love can carry us through fear, the mistakes we make, and the unknown paths ahead. The morning came soft and pale, the sky a thin sheet of gray, and I woke with the familiar tightness in my chest, like a knot that refused to loosen. And I thought about Claire, about Ethan, about the man helping her, about Carl, about all the choices I had made and all the mistakes I had almost repeated. And I realized how fragile trust could be, and how easily fear could push you over the edge. I got dressed quietly, the floorboards creaking under my feet, the smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen, And I paused for a moment by the window, staring at the street below, watching the neighbors go about their day, oblivious to the private battles we carried silently within our lives. And I felt a strange mixture of calm and dread, because I knew the next few weeks would test all of us in ways we weren't prepared for. I drove to Claire's house, not because she had called, but because I wanted to be near her. I wanted to witness her strength and courage, even from a distance, even if she didn't ask for it. And I felt the familiar rush of anxiety as I pulled up to the curb, hoping I wouldn't intrude, that I wouldn't make her feel watched, but simply present, a quiet presence that mattered in subtle ways. She greeted me at the door with a small smile, the kind that didn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes, and I realized again how much she carried on her own, how much grace it took to balance the secret of her illness, the man helping her, and the careful way she planned to reveal the truth to Ethan. And I felt both admiration and guilt because I had almost interfered with everything. We walked to the park, the air crisp and fragrant with wet leaves, the distant hum of traffic soft in the background, and she told me small things about the research program, the treatments, the man helping her, without revealing his full identity. And I listened quietly, feeling the weight of responsibility in my chest, knowing that every wrong move could change everything, and I had to remain patient and restrained. I thought about Ethan and how little he knew about the unfolding story, the secret battles, the careful planning, the quiet heroism of Claire, and I realized again that my place was not to reveal to him, not to control, not to act, but to support silently, to witness faithfully, and to trust that Claire knew what was best for herself and for him. And I felt the lessons settle in me once more, that love often required restraint more than action. Carl called later that afternoon with updates about the man assisting Claire, and I felt a flicker of anxiety rise in me because even though I trusted him, I still worried about what might happen if Ethan somehow found out too soon, or if I misread the signs and acted in fear again. I told Carl to continue monitoring, but quietly this time, without alerting anyone unnecessarily, and I realized that patience was not just about waiting, it was about choosing how and when to act, even under pressure. That evening, Claire called me. She wanted to meet at the cafe where we had first talked, and I drove slowly, letting the city blur past the windshield, the lights reflecting off wet asphalt, and my heart pounded with anticipation because I knew she would finally begin to plan how to let Ethan in slowly to her world without overwhelming him with fear or worry. And I felt both hope and anxiety tangled together in my chest. We sat in silence for a few minutes, letting the hum of conversation around us fade into the background until she finally spoke. She said, "I think it's time Ethan knows something. Small, a start. Not the full truth, but enough for him to understand why I've been distant, why I've been hiding." And I nodded because I understood the delicate balance she was trying to achieve, and I felt my stomach tighten because I knew this was the moment my restraint would be tested, the moment I had to resist the urge to intervene and simply be there as support. She showed me a small stack of papers, notes from her doctor, updates from the research program, a short summary of the man helping her, and she said, "We'll let him read this tonight." I looked at her quietly, my chest heavy with worry and admiration, because she trusted me to be part of this process, and I realized again that love required faith and other people's strength, even when your own fears screamed for control. That night, I stayed at home pretending to read a book while my mind replayed the day, the steps she would take, the careful way she planned to tell Ethan, and I felt every ounce of tension in me coil and release in turns because I knew the revelation would change something in him, something in me, something in all of us. And yet it was necessary, and I had to allow it to happen without interference. When Ethan finally read the papers that evening, I watched quietly from the kitchen doorway, the way he furrowed his brow, the way his lips pressed together, the slight quiver in his hands as he processed the information. And I felt my heart squeeze, because I knew he was finally seeing a glimpse of Claire's strength, of her resilience, of the battles she had fought quietly for months. And I realized again that my role was not to protect him from fear, but to let him witness the courage of someone he loved. He looked up at Claire, and she met his gaze steadily, and I saw the flicker of relief in his eyes, the beginning of understanding, the first thread of trust stretching across the fear and uncertainty. And I felt tears prick my own eyes, because I had underestimated the power of patience, the power of presence, the way love could unfold gently when you allowed it room to breathe. Afterward, we all sat together, the three of us, the quiet hum of conversation punctuated by pauses and small smiles, and I realized that the lessons of the past weeks, the mistakes I had almost made, the fear that had gripped me, had all led to this moment where trust, patience, and love intersected. And I understood that the true strength of relationships was in allowing people to face their own challenges while offering unwavering support without intrusion. I left Claire's house that night, walking slowly to my car, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, the air crisp and still, and I thought about the journey we had all been on, the fragile dance between fear and trust, between secrecy and revelation, between mistakes and forgiveness, and I whispered quietly into the night, I will carry this lesson always, and I meant it, because I knew the true meaning of love had never been more clear. Over the next days, Claire's health continued to stabilize. The man helping her remained in the background, quietly ensuring she had what she needed, and I remained silently supportive, present, without interference, learning again and again that patience, faith, and quiet presence were the most powerful expressions of love, and that fear left unchecked could almost destroy what was strongest in us. And so life continued its delicate rhythm. Each small victory, each careful disclosure, each quiet act of trust reinforcing the fragile yet enduring bonds between us. And I realized that even in the shadow of fear, even when secrets are kept, even when mistakes are made, love, trust, and forgiveness could carry us through the unknown and teach us the strength of human spirit. The morning after Ethan read the papers came quiet and fragile, the light through the blinds soft and hesitant, and I woke with the familiar tightness in my chest, a knot of worry and anticipation, and I realized that life had shifted just slightly, the world not gone chaotic, but changed in ways I couldn't undo, and I had to walk carefully through the new rhythm of our lives. I made coffee slowly, the steam curling up in the cool kitchen air, my hands wrapped around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into my palms, and I thought about Claire, about Ethan, about the man helping her, about Carl, and I knew that the small truths revealed yesterday were only the first ripples of a wave that could grow or fade, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. I drove to Claire's house, not because she asked me to, but because I wanted to be near her, to witness the quiet unfolding of her choices, and I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in my stomach, because even though I trusted her strength, I still feared the unknown, the way people reacted when shadows were lifted and secrets partially revealed. She greeted me at the door, her smile faint but steady, and I felt a pang of admiration because even after all the fear, the spying, the mistakes, she had carried on her shoulders with grace and dignity, and I realized again that my role was to stand beside her, quietly, faithfully, and to let her lead without interference. We walked slowly along the park path, the air crisp and fragrant with wet leaves, the faint hum of distant traffic, the pond reflecting the overcast sky, and she told me about Ethan's questions, the cautious curiosity in his voice, the moments of doubt and hope that flickered across his face, and I listened quietly, absorbing every detail, because each ripple of reaction mattered in the delicate balance of trust and understanding. Carl called with another update, and I felt my stomach twist because even though I trusted his work, the timing was delicate and I had to weigh every action carefully. I told him to continue monitoring, but subtly, to avoid stirring panic or mistrust. And I realized again that restraint was sometimes the hardest part of love, that patience and faith in others were the true tests of character. That evening, Ethan asked Claire if he could help in small ways, and she allowed it, carefully letting him participate without overwhelming him with fear or worry. And I watched quietly from the doorway, the flicker of pride in her eyes, the tentative hope in his, and I felt tears prick my own eyes, because the unfolding of trust was more beautiful than any action I could take. It was delicate and human and powerful. Over the next few days, the ripples continued, each small gesture, each careful disclosure, each thoughtful conversation creating waves of understanding that stretched between us all. And I learned again that mistakes almost made could be forgiven, that patience cultivated could guide the fearful heart, and that love required trust, even when fear whispered to act. One evening, Claire asked me to help organize her medications and appointments. She said she wanted to show Ethan how she managed her health, and I nodded quietly because I knew this was part of the lesson, the slow unfolding of responsibility, the gentle guidance without control, and I felt a deep respect for her courage and intelligence, because she was shaping the way trust could grow even in delicate circumstances. I stayed by her side quietly helping and watching Ethan respond with care and attentiveness, and I felt a wave of relief mixed with pride, because the first ripples of disclosure had not caused chaos, but had begun the slow process of understanding and connection. And I realized again how easily fear could have destroyed this if I had not restrained myself, if I had not trusted her judgment. The next day, Carl called with a minor update. Nothing urgent, just a reassurance that the man helping Claire remained discreet and diligent, and I felt my chest relax slightly, because the shadows of fear had lifted, and I understood finally that support could be steady without intrusion, patience could carry more weight than action, and trust could survive even partial truths. That night, I sat alone by my window, the city quiet beneath me, the air crisp and still, and I thought about the ripples of truth, the delicate unfolding of trust, the slow dance of fear and courage. And I realized that my own heart had learned something profound, that patience, presence, and unwavering faith could guide even the most fragile situations through unknown waters. I whispered to the night, "Thank you for the lessons." And I meant it because I had seen the strength of human spirit, the courage of Claire, the love of Ethan, and I understood finally that even when mistakes are made, even when fear threatens to overtake reason, the true measure of love was in restraint, in trust, in presence, in witnessing the quiet unfolding of life with care. Over the next week, life settled into a fragile rhythm, each small victory, each careful disclosure, reinforcing the lessons of patience, faith, and love. And I felt a sense of calm in my chest, knowing that even in the shadow of fear, the ripples of truth could guide us gently toward understanding, forgiveness, and connection. I watched Claire manage her treatments and appointments with grace, Ethan respond with growing care and confidence, and I realized again that the real story was not about the secrets, the mistakes, the shadows, but about how we chose to respond, how we held space for courage and strength, how we learned to trust without controlling and to love without fear. And so the ripples continued, carrying us forward each day, each small action, each quiet moment reinforcing the delicate balance of life. And I whispered once more into the darkness, "I will carry this lesson always." And I meant it because I had learned the power of patience, trust, and quiet presence in the unfolding of human connection. The morning came pale and quiet, the kind of light that felt like a promise, and I woke feeling the weight of the last weeks still pressing gently on my chest. But this time, it was different. It was softer, like the kind of pressure that reminds you you are alive, you are responsible, you are learning, And I realized finally that the lessons we carry stay with us long after the moment passes. I made coffee slowly, the aroma filling the kitchen, the cup warm in my hands, and I thought about Claire, about Ethan, about the man who had helped her and Carl, and all the shadows and fears I had carried, and I realized that most of them had been illusions of control, illusions of fear that had almost stolen the joy and trust from our lives. If I had let them, I whispered quietly to myself, I will not let them again. I drove to Claire's house, the streets calm and still, the city moving gently around me, and I felt anticipation coil in my stomach, because today felt like a turning point, the culmination of quiet lessons, the fragile truth becoming strong and clear, the moment where patience, faith, and trust came together to create something beautiful and human. She greeted me at the door, her smile warm and steady, her eyes reflecting strength and relief, and I felt tears prick my own eyes because I had underestimated her courage from the beginning. I had let fear dictate actions that were not mine to take, and I realized again how fragile love can be when guided by doubt instead of trust. We walked to the park, the air crisp, the leaves rustling under our feet, the hum of life quiet around us, and Ethan joined us, and I watched him approach her slowly, carefully, with the caution of someone who had just begun to understand the depth of another struggle, and I felt a swell of pride because the ripples of truth had reached him without shattering the delicate balance of trust we had worked so hard to preserve. Claire handed him the latest updates, the treatments, the notes from her doctor, the careful summaries of the man helping her, and he read them quietly, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to awe. And I stood back silently, witnessing the moment, because my role was to let them navigate this together, not to control, not to interfere, not to direct, but simply to support and love quietly. When he looked up at her and their eyes met, there was a flicker of connection, a thread of trust stretching across the weeks of secrecy, of fear, of misunderstanding, and I felt my chest tighten because I knew that patience had carried us here, that restraint had protected the fragile trust that love had required, and I realized finally how much courage it takes to love fully without fear, to trust fully without doubt, and to forgive fully without reservation. Over the next few days, life settled into a rhythm of quiet understanding. Each small gesture, each patient conversation, each moment of laughter reinforcing the bonds between us all. And I learned again that the true strength of relationships is measured not by dramatic actions, but by the constancy of presence, the gentleness of trust, and the courage to forgive and let go. I watched Claire manage her treatments with grace, Ethan respond with empathy and care, and I felt a deep sense of peace because the shadows that had haunted us had lifted, the mistakes I had almost made had been forgiven, and the trust that had been fragile was now strong, resilient, and alive. One evening, we sat together by the window, the city lights soft and distant, the air cool and fragrant, and I reflected on the journey from fear to understanding, from secrecy to revelation, from doubt to trust. And I whispered into the night, I am grateful for the lessons. And I meant it, because the story had taught me the power of patience, presence, and unwavering faith in the strength of others. I realized finally that love is not about control, not about fear, not about knowing everything before it happens. It is about showing up quietly, faithfully, letting those you care for navigate their own paths, allowing courage and trust to grow even in fragile circumstances, and standing by them without judgment or interference. The weeks turned to months, and life continued with its delicate rhythm, each day reinforcing the quiet understanding that fear almost never guides us correctly, but love, patience, and trust always do. And I felt a profound sense of clarity, because I had learned to step back, to listen, to witness, to love without taking over, to allow others to show their strength, and to forgive myself for the mistakes I almost made. On one final walk in the park, Claire smiled at Ethan, the man helping her still in the background, quietly ensuring she had what she needed, and I stood a few steps behind them watching their connection solidify, and I realized fully that the story had come full circle, that the lessons had been learned, that fear had been tempered by love, that mistakes had been forgiven, and that trust had been restored completely. I whispered softly to myself, "Thank you for the journey," and I meant it, because I had never felt more awake, more aware, more connected to the fragile and enduring bonds that make us human, and I knew finally that no matter what came next, we could face it with courage, patience, and love. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and purple, I understood that life would continue to test us, in small ways, in subtle ways, but that the lessons of patience, trust, and quiet presence would guide us through every ripple of fear, every shadow of doubt, every challenge yet to come, and I breathed deeply, feeling a calm joy settle in my chest, because the story had reached its end and we had reached a new beginning.